Good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to the Commonwealth Honors Program Speaker Series, Part 2 with IO Magwood. So this event is co-sponsored by Multicultural and International Student Services and the Office of Civic and Service Learning. Our organizing team members are Kelly Bowes from the Office of Civic and Service Learning, Professor Gordon Curry, Professor Jonathan Bennett, and Professor Carrie Gamache. Our provost, Arlene Rodriguez, is here with us. Arlene, would you like to say a couple of words?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that we're all here together to listen to this incredible speaker. I'm looking forward to this, and I believe there's some wonderful, important lessons that we can learn or relearn, be reminded of as we move forward in our own equity work. So thank you so much.
Yep, thank you, Arlene. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ayo Magwood to you. Ayo is an educational consultant specializing in evidence-based education on historical and structural racism. Her presentations include primary and secondary historical sources, data, quantitative maps, research studies, and original conceptual diagrams. And each session represents 300 to 400 hours of research, synthesis, and graphic design work. Ayo has a BA in Economics and International Relations from Brown University and MSc in Applied Economics from Cornell University. Welcome, Ayo. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And Kelly, can you make sure that everyone is muted, except for me?
Yes, that is true. No one is able to unmute themselves, but folks can use the chat if need be.
Perfect. Okay. So this is number 2 in our series, Contemporary Expressions. So quick logistics, the same as last time. I'm not going to check the chat until the breaks, but feel free to burn it up with the other participants. Speak up to ask clarifying questions, or you may have to ask through Kelly. Feel free to, I do not mind being interrupted, by the way, not at all. If you're having trouble following it, please let me know. Feel free to turn off your camera while I'm presenting and then turn on for the chat discussion at the end. I'll ask all participants to make a comment in the chat at the conclusion of the presentation. I'm willing to hang out for an additional 30 minutes after the session for all who are interested. And the host will email the PDF slide deck and a resource list afterwards. And there is an optional note-taking outline in the chat. Just download it as a Word doc. If you choose to take notes, it will make your life a lot easier because you don't have to rush to transcribe everything. Okay, so I have 2 slides of summary from last time, so we can remember, to refresh our memory, what we learned last time. Historical discrimination continues to impact contemporary racial disparities through 3 principal legacies: racial bias, historical wealth gap, and residential and school segregation. Thus, even if interpersonal racial bias ended, structural racism will continue almost unabated, and racial economic disparities would continue to grow. Generational wealth disparities are the legacy of centuries of public investment in white families while blocking wealth accumulation by Black families. This public investment in white families includes educational benefits under the GI Bill and highly subsidized mortgages under the FHA and VA government mortgage programs. Residential and school segregation is a result of decades of housing discrimination, including racial zoning, racially restrictive housing covenants, white-only subdivisions and suburbs financed by the FHA and VA, and economic exclusionary zoning. The GI Bill and the FHA and VA mortgage programs, which were essentially white-only in practice, are a significant factor behind the dramatic expansions of the white home ownership rates and the white middle class from 1940 to 1970. This historical discrimination continues to impact us today because civil rights legislation only outlawed future discrimination. They did not repair the 2 principal economic legacies of past discrimination, meaning the wealth gap and a residential segregation. Moreover, civil rights legislation was further neutralized during the late 1970s when the definition of racial discrimination and equal protection were redefined in order to require proven explicit intent rather than inequity or segregation themselves outcomes. This very narrow definition of discrimination, called intent doctrine, excludes discrimination due to hidden covert intent, implicit bias, in-group favoritism, which all of the social psychologists agree is actually a stronger impact on discrimination than out-group prejudice, and also the perpetuation of historical discrimination to protect vested economic interests. I just wanted to add that I learned something new the other day. There's this big discrimination case against the American Disabilities Act against, I believe, a community college in California, and they were not, the blind students did not have equal access. They could not access the curriculum and the materials. And the school's defense was that it was unintentional. And so most of the judges ruled that it doesn't matter whether intent is not, doesn't matter. In fact, if you had that requirement, then the ADA would be gutted, because nobody intentionally discriminates against people with disabilities. One judge ruled that indeed you had to have intent, but the school was trying to go to the Supreme Court for it, but eventually backed down because of pressure. Individuals who benefit from the structural advantages created by historical discrimination often reinforce them to protect our self-interest and pass them on to our children, rather than because we are bad or racist. Okay, and we saw, still reviewing from last time, we saw that the legacies of historical racial discrimination continue to impact racial disparities today through bias, racial wealth gap, and residential and school segregation. Remember, I also introduced the idea of monopoly game representing this. So there's the wealth gap and there's segregation. So it's as if whites have been able to play the game for several generations, several centuries, and then blacks join in, but have to catch up when the board is already, the neighborhoods are already monopolized by other groups, and when there's no distribution of cash. And we also saw this, how contemporary racial disparities are impacted by our history. So from the bottom up, from a long time ago, slavery and Jim Crow, the main legacy of this era, this first era, is a social cultural legacy, racial bias and stereotypes. Of course, those are reinforced and reproduced as we go, but the origin is in that earlier era. But what we learned last time was from this era, from the more recent era, from 1930s to 1970. That's the source of most of the economic legacies, the racial wealth gap and residential segregation. Again, yes, slavery and Jim Crow impacted the wealth gap and segregation, but it's mostly the more recent. And I've sort of introduced the idea, but we'll go more into it today. Individuals who this is reproduced and reinforced, these structural inequities, that's sometimes because of bias, but more often because individuals who benefit from the structural advantages created by historical discrimination reinforce them to protect our self-interest and pass them on to our children. Okay, so today our essential questions are, what is structural racism? How does it differ from interpersonal bias? How does historical discrimination continue to impact the present? We already saw this somewhat, we'll reinforce it a little bit. And then we're gonna look at how contemporary structural racism affects racial disparities today. So the agenda is, first I have two quick qualifiers. And then I'm going to briefly address the question, why do recent immigrants succeed when African Americans do not? Then we'll look at what is structural racism, how does it differ from interpersonal bias and racism? And then we'll look at the impacts on education, employment, and home equity. Okay, and finally, there's just one slide, really quick, one slide of some possible policy implications. So let's look at the two qualifiers first. I'm distinguishing today between settled empirical questions and versus policy questions. So empirical questions have a single right or wrong answer that can be discovered through scientific study. And mere empirical questions are considered settled versus open when there's broad-based agreement on the answer among credible experts in the field. And obviously empirical questions are not subject to debate, whereas policy questions are open, debatable questions without a right or wrong answer. Intelligent, informed people disagree on that answer, usually depending on ideology, and those obviously should be debated very much. With respect to racism, the question, does structural racism exist today, is a settled empirical question. There is a ton of data on it, and we're going to see just a small little bit of it today. But what, if anything, should the government do about structural racism? That is an open policy question that should be debated. And so, for example, affirmative action and reparations fall into that, and that should not, positions on that should not be imposed on students. So most of my presentation today is on that first settled empirical question. The very last slide is a policy opinion would be about policies and opinions. I tried to select policies that I thought would be acceptable across the ideological spectrum, but I do want to specify that they are just opinion. Note that some settled empirical questions are considered controversial by some. This is common in any field, like, did the Holocaust take place? Is climate change occurring? Do vaccines cause autism? These are questions that are considered settled by the experts in their field. But of course, there are some segments of the layman public, non-experts, who disagree. And so that's why it's considered controversial. That does not make it any less settled or empirical. So there's tons of, like I said, there's tons of data on it, and all 12 of the Federal Reserve banks, McKinsey, Citigroup, these are not exactly, leftist organizations, all say, well, of course, structural racism exists, just a question of how we address it, right? And then the second qualifier I'm going to make before I start is that while structural inequities are influential, I am not arguing that that's determinate. So disparities in outcomes are a product of 4 factors: individual skill and intelligence, individual effort and hard work. These two we would consider, this is what we consider, this is what we call individual merit, and these are factors within our individual control. And then, of course, the societal privileges and inequities, and not just with respect to race, right, but also gender and socioeconomic class and sexuality, et cetera, right? We can go on and on, urban, rural. And then, but also there's also random luck. We don't like to talk about it, but there's a lot of luck involved as well, right? These are factors outside our individual control. So I just want to, so we're talking about structural racism. It is not determinate. It's one of several factors. Lack of privilege alone does not necessarily explain lack of success. And privilege is not enough. Merit and hard work are equally critical ingredients of success. However, merit and hard work are often not enough. Success is much less likely when you don't also have privilege. So those are my 2 qualifiers. Next, I'm going to briefly address the question you hear often: why do recent immigrants succeed when African Americans do not? So the immigrants tend, that's a huge generalization. Immigrants tend to be very polarized, and not just to the United States, but everywhere. And that is because it's usually economists have found it again and again, it's usually the less educated and the most educated that emigrate to another country. Those who are have middle skills, middle educated, they are best off moving to the capital city or to a major city within their country. So you always find the same pattern. It's college educated or graduate school educated and the non-educated. And you can see that holds true for the United States as well. So for example, recent arrivals to the United States are less likely than US born to have finished high school. 90% of Americans have graduated from high school versus only 77% of recent immigrants. But on the other hand, recent arrivals are also more likely than American born to have finished college and advanced degrees, 41% versus 30%. So you can see that disparity, and oftentimes it's connected to it's correlated with country of origin. So this is the share of foreign-born Asians with a college degree in 2019, and you can see that there's sort of two groups, right? There's Indians, Koreans, Pakistanis, etc., and down here you have Southeast Asians. And so when we say foreign-born with a college degree, so a disproportionate number of these immigrants either had a college degree already in their country or came as foreign students. And so you can see that they're more educated than white Americans. Whereas there's another group that's less educated than even Black Americans, and their outcomes, correlate with this. So we're talking about two different groups, really, right? So you can't exactly lump them into one. We often are thinking only of the most successful. And with Latinos, it's sort of like three groups. You have the higher societal status, lower societal status, depending on the college degree. And also you can see a correlation with the country, the ethnicity, and also the skin color, right? And so you see, and we see that, so there's a third generation. We can see that by I forgot to mention also another factor is that many studies have found that immigrants are self-selective, right? So it's usually the most risk takers, the most entrepreneurial, the most hardworking that immigrate. So they are often not representative. Not just are they not representative of their country and ethnicity, but they're often not representative of their own family, right? So people the people with the health conditions and the learning disabilities, and the ones who don't want to work hard or who fear risk, they stay in their country. So so the United States, that's one of the reasons why the United States is most successful. Actually, it's because we are we're constantly skimming the entire world for the best, the most entrepreneurial, the most hardworking, the smartest, the most risk-taking. But that advantage only lasts for about 2 generations. In general, the third generation, they're just regular Americans of their same level of family privilege. So that is another fact. And then that third, for the third generation, it especially matters your skin color and your ethnicity. So this is a study of income levels of recent immigrants, first generation and third generation. And they found that, so here's third generation white immigrant, there's third generation Black immigrant, and then this is interesting, second generation Mexican immigrant, and third generation Mexican immigrants actually went down. So from people from with darker skin color and from certain ethnicities that where there's a lot of bias in the United States, their trajectory goes more, is similar to that of Black Americans. Okay, so that, but that's, now we're going on to our main question: what is structural racism and how does it differ from interpersonal bias and racism? So the reason why we're looking at this is because we can't dismantle a black box. Right. We know that many of us know that structural racism exists, and we know that somehow it produces disparities in outcomes that are not fully explained by socioeconomic, cultural, or behavioral differences. But we need to look inside that black box and look at where the wires are so that we can dismantle it. So one great allegory of what structural racism is a story by C.P. Jones. So she talked about how when she moved to Baltimore, there were 2 flower pots on her front porch. One had soil in it, the other one did not. So she went out and bought brand new soil and also flower seeds. She put the soil into the empty pot and put the flower seeds into both. The flowers, the flower seeds in the new soil grew much more plentiful and colorful and stronger and bigger than the flowers in the pot with the existing soil. So she realized that that soil was depleted, and she thought that it was just the wonderful allegory of the role of structural challenges. So on one hand, you have the individual merit of the flower seeds, right? But that the flower was both was a product of both the individual merit of the seed, the quality of the seed, and also of the quality of the soil. So the soil is a metaphor for structural racism. It refers to policies and practices and culture. This is what we call structures in society that help the individual merit grow. So you have both. So that's what we mean by structural racism. We're talking about non-individual factors that play a part in outcomes. So again, policies, practices, culture, rules, laws. Whoops, went in the wrong direction. And we're going to find that these all impact those. Okay, so we have learned a lot about historical racism, and so let's put it all together. We're going to see how structural racism, which is rooted in the persistent legacies of historical racism, contributes to the Black-white wealth gap. So on the bottom, in green, you should recognize, hopefully, it's one of the graphs that I showed you last time with the Black-white wealth gap just shrunk up, right? It's green because that's what I'm color coding wealth, right? So we have learned that because of all those historical race policies, there's this historical segregation still impacts today where one lives, right? And where one lives, of course, we know greatly impacts the quality of one's school, because we know that in the United States, about 50% of school funding comes from local property taxes. So if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, then your school has significantly more funding than if your neighborhood is poor. And of course, where one lives is impacted by historical segregation and also directly. And we learned last time about the historical wealth gap. So we know, so access to wealth is also going to impact where you can afford to live, which indirectly impacts the quality of your school through the school budget. But that, and wealth is also going to directly impact the quality of your child's education because you can afford SAT prep and tuitions and a private school tuition and enrichment and travel and tutoring, right? And then the access to wealth is also going to impact whether you can go to college and what the quality of the college, especially because the college tuition has been skyrocketing over the last 2-3 decades. It's far outstripped inflation at the same time that public funding to colleges has plummeted. So some students have low-income students have come to the conclusion that they simply cannot pay back their loans. It's no longer profitable to go to college. So increasingly access to family wealth is determining whether people go to college on top of what kind of college they can go to. And then the access to wealthy parents, family wealth will help you get a job, partly because it's not the advantages of having wealth in the family is not just financial, but also, having wealthy connected parents, right, who know people in right places, and also they can support you while you engage in unpaid internships, right? And they also contribute to the wealth through inheritances or financial assistance, financial gifts. And where you live is going to impact your access to conventional non-predatory lending and banking, very much so. And that access to conventional mainstream credit is going to also impact your ability to go to college and the quality of the college you go to. And the quality of your high school education is going to impact your college prospects and thus also your job prospects, both indirectly and directly. And of course, your income from your job is the other half of your wealth. Your wealth is both your income and your assets, not just your savings, but also your inheritances. So that is a very, very oversimplified model of how structural racism works. And you notice that I have not even mentioned the role of racial bias. So the racial bias is sort of the icing on the cake, right? It exacerbates all of this because, of course, there would be arrows going from racial bias to all these other elements. It's an additional layer, but you notice that it is not the foundation. The foundation is historical segregation, right? And then also we haven't included the role of racial bias in policing and in criminal justice system, or racial disparities in health. Both those will also have arrows going everywhere. So notice two things: that first of all, no individual race is required, right? So even if I waved a magic wand and got rid of all the racial bias, the system would continue in place and racial disparities would continue increasing. And the other thing that you notice is that individual merit is insufficient to achieve successful outcomes in this condition, or I mean, it is possible, but they're going to be outliers. Anybody have any quick questions before I go on about this? No, okay, go on. So you may have heard the word systemic racism as well, and you might want to know the difference between systemic and structural racism. So there's a very subtle difference, but I do warn you that most people use the two words synonymously. So in most settings, they're synonyms, but technically there's a slight difference. Systemic racism refers to the system, right, of how structural racism, meaning the non-individual factors in one institution, for example, education, we can also call that institutional racism, has impacts on employment and on health and on housing, et cetera, and how they all work together. So structural is emphasizing the difference between individual versus non-individual policies, practices, and culture. And when we say systemic, it's emphasizing the systemic aspect between institutions and how one impacts the other. But as you can see, there's a lot of overlap, right? And there's actually a great example of both of them, both structural and systemic racism, in the HBO series, The Wire. So you can see in Through the Wire, you can see a great illustration how the decline of urban labor markets, crime and incarceration, the war on drugs, educational inequities, and effective city governments. Notice these are all different institutions, right? Like the different cogs reinforce each other. That's systemic racism, right? Reinforce each other to produce profound disadvantages for the urban poor, all urban poor, but particularly African Americans, that shape and constrain their individual choices and behavior. These systemic disadvantages become more deeply entrenched over time and across generations, and are specific to place or geography, because that's how historical racism worked. And low-income whites experience structural poverty. You can see that especially in season 2 on the docks, while low-income Blacks experience both structural poverty and structural racism. We refer to this as intersectionality. Individuals with privilege reinforce structural racism to maximize self-interest within the constraints of institutions, including privileged Black people, rather than because they are quote-unquote bad or quote-unquote racist. And now we're going to go on to see how structural racism impacts access to opportunity in 3 different sectors: institutions, education, employment, income, and home equity. So and you're going to be noticing I'm going to be referring to bias, wealth, and segregation, okay? So let's look at education first. So there I have the 3. So we're going to look at K through 12 education first. And this first slide is an overview, and then I'll look at the different studies. And you'll notice they're color coded. So wealth is going to impact whether you have after school job or family responsibilities. In addition to studying, you have less access to tutoring and educational enrichment. Being exposure to bias is often influences stress, results in stress and even hypertension, according to some studies. And we're going to see there's racial bias in grading, discipline, and gifted programs. Segregation is going to impact disparities in school funding and thus also school quality, and even less access to 8th grade algebra, AP, IB, classes, advanced classes. For example, I live in Washington, D.C., and we cannot afford to live in the wealthy white neighborhoods. So my kid goes to a charter school that is the only school that is not in the wealthy white neighborhoods, middle school that offers 8th grade algebra. We were very lucky to get in. College admissions, the racial wealth gap is going to impact your ability to afford tuition. And also we're going to see that SAT and ACT scores are strongly correlated with income, family income. And it also is going to impact your access to SAT prep. And this is spilling over. Notice it's still green, so it's still related to wealth. You're gonna, if you don't have access to family wealth, you're less likely to qualify for preferential admissions. That may sound contrary, but I'll show you the data on it. And also there's college preference for full paying students. I'll show you the evidence on it. And then the geography is the schools in low-income Black and Latino neighborhoods have less access to college counselors, and also colleges have less familiarity with these schools, less likely to visit or reach out to these high schools or have relationships with their college counselors. So that's the overview. Let's look at some of these studies. A 2016 Yale Child Study Program found that Black boys are more likely to be disciplined for challenging behavior, even when they act the same as others. So the study found, concluded that implicit bias among preschool teachers may help explain high preschool expulsion rates for Black boys. So in the study, they had a video of 4 pre-K students playing around a table, one Black boy, one Black girl, one white boy, one white girl. They told the teachers to look out for challenging behavior and then tracked their eyes. So 42% of the time they tracked Black boys. 34% of the time they tracked white boys, meaning that they also had a gender bias. And unsurprisingly, they found challenging behavior among the Black boys, even when none existed. A 2015 Stanford study found that teachers were more likely to view fictitious students with Black sounding names as disruptive, were more likely to see their second infractions as part of a pattern, and were more likely to recommend them for disciplinary action. So in this study, psychologists presented teachers with written vignettes of student misbehavior. The vignettes were identical, except that half had Black sounding names and half had white sounding names. The interesting thing was there was no difference in or significant difference in, statistically significant difference in the first misbehavior infraction. It was in the second infraction that teachers were more likely to see it as a part of a pattern and more likely to recommend it for disciplinary action. Racial bias in grading. In a 2020 USC study, teachers, particularly white women, were 4.7 percentage points more likely to consider the white child's writing at or above grade level compared to the identical writing from a Black child. The researcher created the same second grade essay, one with the name Deshawn that signaled a Black child, and one with the name Connor that signaled a white child. 30% of the teachers thought that the Black child's writing was grade level or above. 35% of the teachers thought that the white child's writing was grade level or above. A study found that Black students were less likely to be identified as gifted, even with qualifying IQ test scores. So this was an unnamed school district in Florida. In 2004, 2005, the purple, that was before this grant. They were using the traditional method of identifying students for their gifted program, which was through teacher and parent flagging. So identified, so students were potentially gifted students were flagged by teachers, and parents were referred to the district psychologist for formal IQ testing. And then those who scored 130 and above were placed in the gifted program. In 2006 and 2007, in the blue, the district got some funding and they did universal testing. So all students in the class did a informal, shorter, cheaper version of the IQ test in the classroom. Those that got above a certain cutoff point were then sent to that same district psychologist to do the formal IQ testing, and those that got 130 and above were placed in the gifted program. Numbers for girls, including white girls, Blacks, Hispanics, English language learners, and low-income students all increased. Unfortunately, the lost funding went back to the old method, and the numbers, the shares went right back to the old ones. Even knowing about the bias, they could not control for it. The likelihood that white parents will choose a hypothetical school for their children drops significantly as the proportion of Black students in the student body increases, independent of the hypothetical school test score rank. In this study, again, it was fictitious schools. The white parents claimed that they were choosing the school based on test scores, but in the controlled studies, the white parents consistently chose schools based on. They found that that their choice was based more on the percent of Black kids than on the actual scores. Two studies have identified significant and growing grade inflation over the last 20 years, but notably more in affluent and private high schools. So grade inflation was defined as an increase in GPA that was not matched by an increase in standardized test scores, for example, the SAT, or in some cases, the AP. So this gap has been growing only in private schools and affluent schools. This is from one of the studies, but the other study found similar results. The researchers hypothesized that wealthier parents have more time and more confidence to be pushy and to challenge teachers, and also that expectations were high and that perhaps teachers were censoring themselves. And this is across the board. This, like the other one, this has nothing to do with race, but of course it's going to disproportionately affect African Americans. This is a study this is data from the Department of Education across the country. And over here on the left is low, middle, and high standardized test scores on standardized assessments of math. For kids from families in the poorest quartile, low-income families. And over here on the right are low, middle, and high test scores, math test scores for of kids in families in the highest quartile, the high-income families. And the graph is measuring college graduation rates. So wealthy students with low test scores are slightly more likely to graduate from college than poor students with high test scores. In other words, socioeconomic class is more important to college graduation in the United States than academic achievement. And again, this is across the board for all races, but it's going to disproportionately affect Black African Americans. And other studies by the OECD have confirmed that United States has pretty much the lowest levels of educational mobility among the high income countries. SAT scores are strongly correlated with family wealth and are a less reliable predictor of college performance than is GPA. And that is one of the reasons why some colleges have started moving away from the SAT. You can see that is strongly correlated by family income. So here, this is testing, comparing how well GPA versus SAT can predict 6-year college graduation rates. So that is how well the GPA can predict college graduation rates, and that is how well the SAT can. So, and the reason why the GPA is a better predictor is because it's not influenced by income. So here I can explain it better with this. So you may be familiar that Texas has a top 10% rule that they implemented in 1997. So this TTP guarantees students who graduate in the top 10% of their high school automatic admission to any UT college. So this is, I might have shown you this last time, this is Harvard University's Opportunity Atlas. So this is measuring the share of low income children of all races who are in the top 20% of household incomes by age 35. So in other words, upward mobility, right? Rags to riches, American dream. And you can see that upward mobility varies dramatically from place to place. So the darker, for that red area, for example, has very probably has very little access to opportunity, or much significantly less access to opportunity than, for example, this region, which has lots of access to opportunity. So what the interesting thing is in the TTP, they found that if you take the top 10 students of that area and the top 10 students of that area, even though the SAT scores vary dramatically, those students are going to perform roughly equally in college. And that is because you're sort of holding the levels of privilege in the area constant. So among kids with the X level of privilege and access to opportunity, the top 10% are going to be those who are the smartest and the ones who are hardest working, right? So you can measure, you can separate individual merit from access to privilege. And that is why the GPA is a better predictor of graduation rates. College tuition, as I mentioned, has soared and far outstripped inflation, the rate of inflation. College degree is increasingly essential for economic progress, yet increasingly out of financial reach for students from low-income families of all races. We're going to see in this that the structural racism is really the proverbial canary in the mines, that we have a major problem of economic calcification, right? We have very low levels of mobility. We have the lowest levels of economic mobility and educational mobility out of all the wealthy countries. This is affecting all low-income students or low-income people. But of course, because of historical discrimination, African Americans get affected significantly more, right? Disproportionately more, but it's part of a larger problem. Colleges informally give preference to white wealthy students. There's a popular and persistent image of college admissions in which diversity-obsessed universities are using affirmative action to deny spaces to academically talented affluent students while admitting low-income students with lower ability in their place. Sorry, this is from Paul Tufts' book, The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes or Breaks Us, retitled The Inequality Machine, How College Divides Us. Oakenstead, head of enrollment at DePaul in Oregon State, says the opposite is closer to the truth. If you're an enrollment manager, he explains the easiest category of students for you to admit are below average students from high income families. Because their parents can afford tutoring, they're very likely to have decent test scores, meaning SAT test scores. Which means they won't hurt your US News ranking. They probably won't distinguish themselves academically at your college, but they can pay full tuition. Even with affirmative action, Blacks and Hispanics are more underrepresented at top colleges than 35 years ago. This is between 1982 and 2017. Again, this contradicts the big myth of affirmative action. And that is partly because affirmative action doesn't really exist anymore. Racial quotas and granting points was ruled unconstitutional in 1978. Schools can now only consider race as a factor of a factor of a factor, as one of many factors of a student's lived experience. The two examples given were leadership experience as the president of a Black student union or an essay on the importance of the Korean church community. So, in fact, more wealthy white students benefit from preferential admissions than do Black students because preferential admissions based on race are unconstitutional, but there's nothing against preferential admissions based on wealth. There's tons of that. So for example, this is data from an economic study that was Exhibit A in the court case Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard in 2019, which was it was an anti-affirmative action case. They claimed that Asian students were being disproportionately, discriminated against in admissions in favor of Black and Latino students who got in through affirmative action who were underqualified. So again, this is a study for the group that was against affirmative action. So because of that, they were able to take Harvard University to court and get all of their internal admissions data. So this was the first time we get to see everything unadulterated. So we get to see the sausage being made behind the scenes. So this is the data from all students admitted to Harvard from 2014, 2019. The takeaway I saw was they claimed that Asian students were not being discriminated against. It's hard to tell, but I thought I saw a little bit of discrimination against Asian students, but it certainly wasn't because of Black students, but rather of unqualified wealthy white students. And here you can see the data, which again is which was presented on the part of those who were against affirmative action. So let's look at the first column, that first column on the left. Those are all the white students who were admitted under preferential admissions, made up 43% of white admits. So the preferential admissions included athletes, and yes, there was one or two basketball and football players, but most of the athletic scholarships go to sports like fencing and squash, which are predominantly wealthy students. In fact, an internal study at Harvard found that about 50%, about half of the athletes came from families that made 200,000 and above. So of athletes who applied, 86% were admitted. Of legacy students who applied, whose parents went to Harvard, 34% were admitted. Dean's interest list, that means donors and VIPs, 42% were admitted. Children of faculty, 47% were admitted, versus African Americans, 7.5% were admitted. Turning back to the chart on the second column, this is a subset of the first column. This is 32% of white admits. These were white admits candidates who did not meet Harvard University admissions officers' own internal qualification standards of minimum standards. So they were unqualified based on Harvard University's own standards, but the preferential admissions pushed them over the line. And these were 32% of white admits. And then on the third column, try as they might, they could not find any evidence of affirmative action because, again, it's unconstitutional. So they were forced to put on list every single Black student that was admitted. So of course, we don't know it's impossible to know the share since we don't have full information, but at least in absolute terms, if any Asian students were denied admittance, it's much more likely that they were pushed out by an unqualified wealthy white student than by a Black student. And in fact, many Black and Hispanic students who qualified to study at selective colleges who have the SAT scores do not attend. So there's a big undermatch of students who have the qualifying SAT scores, but don't make it to a selective college. And so because of all this, wealthy white students are much more likely to attend a highly selective institution. So this is the percent of students attending highly selective institutions by race within income quartile. And we can see that it varies very much by both race and income level are huge factors, but wealthy white students have the highest chance of attending a highly selective institution, college. And in fact, and again, this is across the board, not just for race, but across the board, 38 colleges have more students from the wealthiest 1% than from the poorest 60%. So very low educational mobility. So all of these colleges, and this is a searchable database, all these colleges, as you can see, 20 to 25% of the student body comes from the top 1%, families making $630,000 a year and more. And high achieving students from high income families are 3 times as likely to enroll in a selective institution as those from low income families. In fact, 16%, a big chunk of high achievers from the poorest 25% don't go to college at all. And I think we saw this last time, but because of residential patterns rooted in historical segregation, they very much impact racial disparities in school funding and thus also quality of education. So for every student enrolled, the average non-white school district receives $2,226 per student less than a white school district. And it's the gap is much starker in many local areas. It's just average. And in fact, so Black children are more than twice as likely as white children to attend high poverty schools. High poverty schools are defined as schools in which 51 to 100% of students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. A study found that, and this is important because the study found that children in public housing who attended schools with wealthier schoolmates where fewer than 20% qualified for free or reduced meals far outperformed those who went to school with poorer students. This is a study done on the Montgomery County, Maryland Moving to Opportunity Fund, in which low-income residents from public housing were randomly assigned to moderately priced subsidized housing in wealthier neighborhoods. The researcher studied 850 of these students, 72% Black, over a 5 to 7 year span from 2001 to 2007. And she found that by the end of elementary school, the poor students who attended the wealthier schools made a huge dent in the achievement gap. I want to point out that it's not the fact that you're sitting next to a white or wealthy schoolmate, but rather access to, access to labs, science labs, and quality teachers, and lower student or higher student teacher-student ratio, et cetera. Okay, so that's education. We're going to move to employment. Now, before I start, the assumption is often that in the absence of affirmative action, labor markets are largely meritocratic and colorblind, and that is simply not true. A 2016 study found that Black job candidates are far less likely to get called for an interview if a hiring manager can tell that the applicant is Black, even with exact same credentials, and same with Asian candidates. Researchers sent out matched resume pairs in response to real job ads. They sent the original non-whitened version, and then they sent a paired whitened version. So if you could tell from the first name that the candidate was either Black or Asian, then they switched up, they used the middle name or an initial. And for example, if the person was, let's say, president of the Korean Student Association or the Black Student Association, they would change it to president of a student association. They found that minorities who whitened job resume got more interviews. 25% of the whitened Black resume received callbacks versus 10% of the non-whitened versions. For Asian candidates, 21% of the whitened resumes received callbacks versus 11.5% of the non-whitened versions. And in fact, this is just one example, but there's many others we're going to see next. Although a credential from an elite university results in more employer responses for all, Black candidates from elite universities only do as well as white candidates from less selective universities. And those are just two examples of two specific studies, but meta-analysis of callback rates from all existing field experiments, 24 total studies, including data from more than 54,000 applications across more than 25,000 positions with matched resumes or matched testers, showed evidence of discrimination against Black applicants. Since 1990, white applicants received on average 36% more callbacks than matched Black applicants. There was no change in hiring rates over the 25 years. And Black women experience both the racial wage gap and the gender wage gap. Researchers have found that the cumulative impact of being both Black and female is greater than the sum of its parts, meaning it's multiply versus adding. Black women earn just 64 cents for every dollar that white men earn, which is above and beyond the sum of the wage penalties they experience when compared to Black men or to white women. Of the 36-cent pay gap, 55% is unexplained and likely due to discrimination, while the remaining 16 cents is due to factors such as education, family structure, occupation, and industry. And discrimination, like I've mentioned before, discrimination is much more likely to be a product of in-group favoritism than of out-group prejudice. For example, the old boys network, as we call it sometimes. So the social psychologist Marilyn Brewer wrote, ultimately, many forms of discrimination and bias may develop not because outgroups are hated, but because positive emotions such as admiration, sympathy, and trust are reserved for the in-group. Leniency bias refers to rigorously applying objective rules to outgroups while giving members of favorite groups the benefit of the doubt. For example, studies have found that women and minority candidates are more likely to be judged on their actual performance, while male and majority candidates are often judged on their potential. Individuals also attribute less blame and recommend less severe punishment for in-group transgressions compared with those of outgroups. So we're going to see an example of that. Sociologist Lauren Rivera sat in on hours and hours of interviews at a major consulting firm. I would love to know which one it was. Of course, she doesn't name it. And she found that leniency, she could really see the effects of leniency bias. She found, that Black and Hispanic men were often seen as lacking polish in their communication style, even when they were strong otherwise, whereas white men who lacked polish were deemed coachable. Non-whites were rejected as unassertive, but modesty in whites was seen as a virtue. Among candidates who made minor mistakes in math, women were rejected, while men were given a pass as having an off day. When discussing final decisions, evaluators shifted their focus away from the candidate's performance and towards chemistry and gut instinct. They barely discussed technical skill unless evaluating women, particularly in banking. Evaluators advocated most fervently for people who were most like them. Women and minorities tended to feel more vulnerable in their status at the firm and thus champion fewer people than white men. With white men doing most of the championing and having the greatest influence during deliberation, candidates' similarities to interviewers tilted the playing field heavily in favor of white, affluent, athletic graduates of super elite universities. And also, we can also see a big source of structural inequity is employee referrals. Informal surveys show that approximately a third of hires are through employee referrals. And because of our geographic segregation, then our informal networks are also very segregated. And so it's if your employees are mostly white and male, then your referrals are going to be disproportionately white and male as well. And then getting away from bias to more structural factors, a ton of economists and sociologists have identified the role of spatial mismatch, which is a geographic mismatch between where low-income residents live, particularly African-American low-income residents in urban areas, and where low-skilled jobs, which are these days mostly service jobs, are located. So before deindustrialization, we had middle-skilled jobs, which were factory jobs and manufacturing jobs, and these were located mostly in the cities where low-income residents live. But of course, after deindustrialization, most of that was mechanized. Most of those jobs are gone. So we have a job polarization between high-skilled jobs that you need a college degree and low-skilled service jobs. But an additional factor is that these low-skilled service jobs are mostly located in the suburbs because that's where the wealthy white consumers live, and also because real estate is cheaper there. So let's look at the example of Dallas, Texas. So this is a GIS map. The darker blue areas in the south indicate where the concentration of African Americans is higher. The black spidery dots indicate low-income housing. So that's a good proxy for where low-income residents are concentrated. And you can see that's also in the South. The orange is their public transportation system. So now I'm going to superimpose the growth of jobs, okay? So this is low-wage jobs added between 2002 and 2015. So they're probably mostly service jobs. And you can see that they're located in the suburbs and in the wealthier white neighborhoods, because again, that's where the consumers are. So that is what we mean by spatial mismatch, that low-income workers, particularly African Americans, cannot physically have trouble getting to the job. So economists have found this fascinating phenomenon where in the same job boards for the same metro area, you have at the same time a huge unmet demand in employees. Employers cannot find employees to fill their job openings. And at the same time, in the exact same job board, you find tons of job candidates who are looking for a job and cannot find a job because they physically or logistically cannot reach the job. They don't have a car. Our public transportation systems in the suburbs are very inadequate and very expensive. So this is what we refer to as spatial mismatch. And again, it's a result, it's greatly impacted by historical discrimination. And that was an example from Dallas, Texas, but this happens. You can see this same spatial mismatch in many cities. So this is Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. And this is all job growth of any kind, change in employment from 1991 to 2001. You can see that there's very little, if any, job growth in the cities, which is green. You can see the job growth is in the suburbs and in the outer suburbs, the orange and the beige. But of course, low-income residents, particularly African-American low-income residents, are located in the cities. And we also, we saw this last time, the impacts of wealth, that wealth that we saw, that's how geography affects it. And with respect to how wealth affects employment, you can notice that several of these things are related to employment, right? Well-connected personal contacts, help with starting a business. So family wealth is also going to impact your employment prospects. And last, we're going to look at home equity. So housing discrimination still persists. This is a Department of Housing and Urban Development nationwide study spanning 28 metropolitan areas, which revealed a pattern of discrimination against minorities seeking information to rent or purchase a home. So this is the difference in access to housing for minorities in the US as a percentage of white access. And Black prospective buyers are told about fewer properties for both renting and buying. And here's a more specific example of that. So this is 50 years after the 1968 Fair Housing Act, a 3-year paired undercover actor investigation by Newsday found evidence in Long Island, New York, of racial steering, denial of service, more stringent financial qualifications, and widespread separate and unequal treatment. So paired white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian undercover actors with hidden cameras presented similar financial profiles and requested identical terms for houses in the same areas. Compared to the white testers, Black testers experienced disparate treatment 49% of the time, Hispanic testers 39% of the time, and Asian testers 19% of the time. And similar to that school study, a video experiment found that white respondents who saw a neighborhood with only Black residents evaluated it significantly more negatively than similar whites who saw exactly the same neighborhood, but with white residents. For white participants, simply seeing Black residents in a neighborhood elicited more negative evaluations of the neighborhood conditions, even when all aspects except race were comparable between neighborhoods. African Americans and Latinos continue to be routinely denied conventional mortgage loans at rates far higher than their white counterparts in 61 metro areas. The 2018 study, which examined Home Mortgage Disclosure Act records, controlled for 9 economic and social factors, including an applicant's income, the amount of the loan, the ratio of the size of the loan to the applicant's income and the type of lender, as well as the racial makeup and median income of the neighborhood where the person wanted to buy property. So for example, this is the Black odds ratio in Florence is 3.777. That indicates that Blacks in Florence are 3.77 times more likely to be denied a loan than a white counterpart. A University of Berkeley study found that both lending officers and software-based underwriting engines charge Latino and African-American loan applicants interest rates that are 6 to 9 basis points higher than white applicants with the same FICO score and loan-to-value ratio. Unfortunately, algorithms have a lot of potential, but the problem is that humans make those algorithms and often bake bias into the algorithm. So you have to work hard to create algorithms that are free of human bias. And when Black families do own homes, their homes are less likely to appreciate in value, and they appreciate more slowly when they do. So neighborhood differences and the quality of homes can explain only part of this low rate of appreciation. Researchers posit that racial animus can account for the remaining difference in appreciation between Black-owned and white-owned homes. So you see here, even after the adjustments for structural characteristics and of home and neighborhood amenities, homes of similar quality in neighborhoods with similar amenities are worth 23% less in majority Black neighborhoods. So it's an average loss of $48,000 in home market value. And as we saw, remember we saw this racial wealth gap before. I don't know if you noticed before, but you can see that Black median household wealth has been decreasing since 2000. And there's many factors, but two biggest factors is the increase in economic exclusionary zoning. So economic exclusionary zoning has been skyrocketing since roughly about 2000. So that's one factor, but the other factor is that Blacks, along with Latinos, were targeted for subprime mortgages during the 2000s, even when they qualified for conventional loans. And so they were hit much harder by the subprime mortgage crisis. President Obama bailed out the banks, but not the homeowners, and the affected homeowners were disproportionately low to middle income Blacks and Latinos. So during 2000, Latino and Black neighborhoods were targeted for subprime mortgages, even those that had good credit and qualified for conventional mortgages. Subprime mortgages were extremely profitable for banks with zero risk because they get passed that on. It was too much to resist. And so they targeted low-income Black and Latino neighborhoods where they figured they could get away with it. The interesting thing is that many of those neighborhoods were formerly redlined neighborhoods. But we call this, by the way, we call this reverse redlining, because remember, redlining means that you are denying credit to an area, everyone located in that neighborhood, regardless of their individual situation, right? So reverse redlining is the opposite. You have targeted that neighborhood for a particular financial instrument. Again, everybody in that neighborhood, regardless of their individual situation. And so the percentage of higher rate mortgages, meaning subprime mortgages, among borrowers with a FICO score of 660 or higher by race. So the Fair Isaac Corporation, which creates this scores, classifies scores of 660 and above as good, which means that they would have qualified for conventional rate, but instead the bank sold them a subprime mortgage rate. And even today, this is just one example, but even today, predatory lending, banking, and predatory banking and predatory real estate is often place-based and targeted at low income and Black and Latino neighborhoods. Again, this is called reverse redlining. And because of this, like I said, partly it's Black Americans are the only racial group that has not recovered from the Great Recession and still earn less than they did in 2000. And then very quickly, we're going to look at some policy implications. So again, up until now, we've looked at empirical questions. This is a policy question. This is so just be opinion, but I've worked hard to identify some policies that I believe would be acceptable to people across the ideological continuum. And they're very much coming from what we have studied. So improving access to opportunity. We say that everybody has equal access to opportunity. It's clearly not true. And it's not just based on, in fact, it may be based more on place rather than race. Of course, there's a huge correlation between place and race because of historical discrimination. But at least in theory, we may be able to focus on improving access to opportunity in certain areas, in areas that have very low access to opportunity, regardless of the race of the people in there. Of course, they're going to be disproportionately Black, but that would be a way of getting race out of it, since that is, since race-based policies are unacceptable to some people. Improving access to quality schools is a no-brainer. Again, we have not just the lowest economic mobility rates in the wealthy countries, but the lowest rates of educational mobility, which is probably why we have the lowest rates of economic mobility. So that, and this makes sense, not just only from an equity point of view, but from overall, our GDP will grow, our country will do better if we have access to the best minds, right? And the most hardworking people. So it's not just from an ethical view, it's not just from a political principle view, but also from a purely economic point of view, right? We need to improve geographical access to good quality jobs. The same thing. It's not just equity, right? It's just being effective, just plain economics. We need to increase access to conventional non-predatory banking and lending. We need to support Black homeownership is an obvious, besides education, Black homeownership is based on our history and the historical discrimination. That's an obvious place to start. And we need to reduce downward mobility among middle-class Black families. Because of this access to opportunity, middle-class Black families have a much higher downward mobility rate than white families, middle-class families. And we should think about supporting inclusionary zoning, or at least reducing or limiting exclusionary zoning, and try to foster mixed income neighborhoods and schools. Again, that would be a way of taking race out of it to make it acceptable across the board. This seems to be things that would be both acceptable to people of different ideologies and also extremely effective. It's in a way we're looking at, so if we think of these trees as the branches of the tree as outcomes, right? So college attainment, test scores, income, wealth, employment, home ownership, and health. And it's because the branches don't come out of nowhere, right? It's partly because remember those flowers and the flower pot that we saw in the beginning. The outcomes are due not just to the individual effort, but also to the soil, right? The soil is the structural factors. So, and essentially it's access to opportunity, right? It's access to education, access to public and environmental safety, access to conventional credit, access to informal job networks, access to healthcare. These are all structural factors beyond the individual factors that are going to impact outcomes regardless of outside of individual merit and luck. So this is what we have to address down here on the bottom right panel, right? Because this is how the legacies of historical discrimination continue to impact today. Through high poverty K-12 schools, inadequate access to healthcare, neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, limited access to mainstream banking and credit. That's what we have to address. And instead of affirmative action would be on the top. Affirmative action would be addressing the branches on the top. And we know that's that's not acceptable for some people. So fine, I think we can all agree that we can concentrate on the bottom, those inputs, essentially access, making sure that everybody has access to opportunity, regardless of income level, regardless of race, and regardless of place. So we have finished our seminar. We had 3 questions, essential questions. What is structural racism? How does it differ from interpersonal bias and racism? How does historical discrimination continue to impact the present? And how does contemporary structural racism affect racial disparities? So here's a summary. Structural racism refers to policies and practices that result in systematic racial disparities in outcomes across institutions that are not explained by individual merit, whether intentional or not. These policies and practices reinforce each other to produce profound disadvantages for the urban poor, particularly African Americans, that shape and constrain their individual choices and behavior. Historical discrimination continues to impact contemporary racial disparities through 3 principal legacies: racial bias, a historical wealth gap, and residential and school segregation. Thus, even if all interpersonal racial bias ended, structural racism would continue almost unabated, and racial economic disparities would continue to grow. Wealth is important because families with wealth can help their children avoid crippling college loans, support them during unpaid internships, use personal contacts to help them get a job, and assist them with mortgage down payments or private schools for grandchildren. Wealth provides a financial cushion to help weather national and household financial shocks, and makes it easier to start a business, change careers, or go back to school. What about geography? Where one lives greatly impacts one's access to opportunity. That's referred to as the geography of opportunity. Access to employment, public transportation, public safety, mainstream credit, healthcare, and most crucially, quality public schools. Since almost half of public school funding comes from local property taxes, our public school system reinforces racial and economic inequality instead of acting as an engine of mobility. Okay, I would love for everybody to make a comment in the chat. Please contribute something you've learned, something that was surprising, something that was particularly interesting or insightful, or question or connection or pattern.
And Ayo, do you think we could also take questions as people putting things on the chat?
Yes, of course.
Okay, I thought I saw a hand raised, but I don't see it now. But David, you had a question. You can start because you're going to be leaving soon.
Oh, no, I had written them into the text, but I'll just briefly, I was curious about the charter school movement. I know that was part of white flight, and that has that held true consistently across the country, do you know, or is it regional, that charter schools as methods of white flight and subverting civil rights rulings and legislation, is that regional, or is it consistently a factor across the country? And the second part of the question is, again, you've created your presentation has all this great information about how embedded institutional racism is in U.S. culture, legal system, et cetera, housing policies and what have you. I'm going to raise the question, particularly for everyone here. Is there any movement? Is there any national movement to create national educational policy, even though it's local, and I understand all that, but just like we have civil rights legislation and civil rights Supreme Court rulings in the past to make sure that localities and states don't subvert civil rights legislation and rulings, is there any attempt in the country to get national legislation so that states like Texas and other red states, quite frankly, don't subvert educational processes that essentially lie to students about our past and present?
It's a lot of questions.
I know,
Sure.
and I'll stop and I will not ask any more.
The charter school, I have to admit that both as a teacher and a parent, I have seen charter schools, majority in DC, we have a lot of 100% Black and Latino charter schools, and they're a Band-Aid on the, on the wound. So of course, the bigger problem is this huge inequities. And so that's what should be addressed. But given the inequities, I was appreciative to have that option for my child, for example, that has, for instance, like my kid, I mean, it's 2 out of 5 stars. It's a shitty school, but at least, excuse my language, but at least it has, like I said, he has access to algebra, 8th grade algebra. So I have to admit, I like that, but of course, it's just a Band-Aid. Of course, much preferable would be equity, across the board and racial integration. My kid's school is 100% Black and Latino. All the white kids go to the wealthy schools. So, and as we've seen, it's a Band-Aid in some, unfortunately, a lot of Black and Latino parents like me are supporting charter schools because it's a Band-Aid, it's like a lifeline, right? But the bigger picture, the long picture, the underlying problem is it's like you said, it's subverting the problem, and it's leading to more segregation instead of solving the problem. Second thing is, I don't know how to address the new bills and policies against the CRT, but I think the approach that I use, which I am very happy to share with other teachers, I share very openly and freely with teachers and professors who want to teach it. I believe it would pass muster under more moderate laws, because I'm not teaching, that any group is and against any group. I'm just teaching. It's very evidence-based. So there are some settings that I think it could pass, and I'm very happy to share for free. Third thing is there's a huge structural. Speaking of structural, this is legal and constitutional block constraint to equity across school boards, and that is the what's called federalism. So under federalism, as you guys know, the 10th Amendment, all rights, powers that are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, if they're not specifically assigned to one of the 3 branches of the federal government, fall to the people, meaning the states. And schools and education are not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, which means that it is underneath federalism, underneath the 10th Amendment, that falls to the states. And that is the reason why we have, that's why a big chunk of the funding comes from local property taxes. And that is why it's very difficult for federal government to impose restrictions and laws, education laws. The only way they can do it is by withdrawing funding, the extra funding. Let's say we have this extra funding, for example, for your Title I schools, but you can only have it if you do such and such. But the federal government has no power on its own to just impose a rule. So that is a big problem. Some local areas are trying to get around that. I understand San Francisco is trying an open enrollment system. Unfortunately, in many areas, wealthy parents, usually white, wealthy parents, manage to subvert all of these efforts. No matter what the local government comes up with system to try to make it fair, wealthy parents will subvert it. And it's not because, again, it's not because they're openly racist or anything, but, partly I think because we've scaled back all of the safety nets, right? There's no safety nets. So it's all everyone on their own, right? And the competitive is vicious. And if you fail, right, it's not like in the 1950s, there was government safety nets. It wasn't, the stakes weren't as high, but now the stakes for winning are so high that families, they will do everything and anything under their power to make sure that to ensure that their child has the best effort. So for example, the public school system that's the most segregated in the entire country, guess what it is? New York City. the most segregated. All of the best quality schools are completely monopolized by wealthy families, because if they have a good school system, a good school, they're going to just grab it. They use their resources, their connections, their contacts, everything. It's very hard to address that. I think the larger problem again is our lack of safety, and it's our lack of good quality public school, our lack of that makes this all for nothing Scrabble, everyone for their own. So I think I've addressed some of your questions at least.
Melina, did you want to ask a question or make a comment?
It's kind of related, not related. I was just asking more of a question because she was talking about kids going into school and how the top 1% is usually who gets like this, like a acceptance. Do you think HBCUs follow that same type of I don't know, admittance strategy or whatever? Because I'm looking into HBCUs, so I'm just curious.
Within the Black community, you see the same pattern, right? So wealthy Black people, we opportunity hoard just as much as wealthy white people. And I see, for instance, every time I come up with, when I say legacy, we should get rid of legacy, every single wealthy white parent on the call says, well, except for Blacks, they don't. And it's true in some ways, because, for instance, African Americans, we do have much higher levels of downward mobility. But so they have a point to a certain degree, but I'm trying to say that, remember, these are universal human tendencies. So yes, you see a lot of it replicated within the Black community and within schools. So unfortunately, even the HBCUs, I'm sure, probably have a little bit of a bias towards the wealthiest Black kids, but also our society in general. Like, who's going to get to the door, right? Who's going to get to the door of applying to the HBCUs? Who's going to get there and who's going to have the highest scores, unfortunately, is partly a reflection of their privilege. Less so than in the PWIs, in the predominantly white students. So HBCUs have a great record of being more open, right? Of having more kids who are first generation, et cetera. But you still see a watered down version of those same tendencies. Does that make sense?
It does. I just read somewhere recently that like there's more of like a white population and like more diverse students at HBCUs due to like sports, like a lot of them being D1 schools and stuff. And that goes back to like the whole college admission scandals where white parents are paying off admissions to get their kids into a D1 school. So it's also like stuff like that I've seen. Like,
so there's a lot of activity going on in the chat, but if you don't mind, if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hands and ask them verbally here, because it's impossible to just follow what's going on in the chat right now.
There's some great conversations in the chat, particularly on standardized testing. I had Gordon asked me to ask this question. He's driving, I think, and there's a lot of background noise. He wanted to know, I'm curious about how the perceptions of affirmative action came to be versus what the data reveals. If you could speak to that.
I think, unfortunately, this is mostly just psychological motivation. So, and then unfortunately, this is normal, right? I think it's a combination of like I said, the stakes have gotten so high, right? The stakes have gotten so high because it's become like a winner, what to call a winner takes all. We have winner take all market, and the stakes for the trying to get to the highest, to the best schools are very high. And then it's a combination of that and bias. Right, so it's called, hold on, let me see, I'm just gonna really quickly, so it's called attribution error, right? So we attribute our success to our group's success to hard work and talent, or to our individual, right? And our lack of success is due to unfairness or adverse circumstances. But their group's success is due to luck and unfair advantages, and their lack of success must be due to not working hard enough, right? So you can clearly see that bias. And then let's see, you might remember, I'm going to bring your attention back to this. Remember when we saw this last time? Yuval Noah Harari's that cause and effect, that cycle. And so we have today, there's this assumption by many people that the best candidate is always white. There's an assumption. And so if you see a Black person who has who got a college degree, got admitted to the college, they must have gotten there because of affirmative action. Whereas the assumption where a white person got into college, it must have been based on merit. So it's a combination of all of that together. But it's vicious. I know some of my former teacher friends, like this former teacher who was at an elite school here in Washington, D.C., I won't name it, but she said she was appalled. A couple of years ago, 2 kids applied to, I think, Duke or somewhere, Dartmouth, I think. And she says the Black student, she says they're about both equally, merit, but she goes, the Black student worked her butt off, always, constantly, and the white male student, she said, was pretty talented, but he was lazy. He was constantly cut corners, and he would use his privilege to get away with things. And she got in and he didn't. And she says he spent the next 2 weeks going around the school talking to everyone about how she stole his spot and that he should have gotten this spot. And she said nobody in the school corrected him. And she was appalled. Because she's like, anyone who's taught these 2 kids, there's no contest of who should have gotten in. But there's this assumption because, she's a Black student, she couldn't possibly have been a better candidate than I am.
Yeah, Gordon got to the comment before I did, but it reminds me of the current Supreme Court conversation, and what a challenge it is for Judge Ketanji Jackson Brown to be up against. Everyone is saying that she can't, or many people are saying that she can't possibly be as qualified. So it is fascinating to watch. There was also a good conversation in the chat about standardized testing. I don't know if either of the students that had comments or questions around that want to ask a question or speak to that comment. I'm talking a lot, so I'm gonna let somebody else.
I was the one who asked about standardized testing, because you mentioned it a bit earlier, talking about colleges and stuff. I was wondering, like, if you think that we should get rid of it because it's not really equitable or anything. That like it was supposed to, quote unquote, before basically evening the playing field, but it clearly isn't working like that. So do you think we should get rid of standardized testing because it's clearly not working? Sorry.
Okay, so first of all, there's a lot of standardized testing, right? So they were specifically talking about the SAT, right? And of course, a big part of that is the SAT prep. It's not necessarily the SAT itself. Yes, there's some bias in it, but I think the biggest factor is the SAT prep. There's such huge differences in, in the prep. People, at least in DC, parents hire tutors that are literally $500 an hour to prep their kids on the SAT. And, surprise is surprise. I'm not in the college space, but I do notice that a lot of colleges are getting away from that. And apparently informally underneath, they had stopped thinking, like you saw in that quote, informally, admissions officers were not putting much stock in that with respect to, whether they thought the student would be a successful student or not, but rather only admitting students based on the SAT for their US News and World Report score. So a big thing might be to try to get rid of that U.S. News and World score, or have that that score be more, to include other things and not be so heavily, not so heavily count the SAT. So yeah, I'm not like an extreme, like, standardized testing is bad, but it's all how you do it, right?
So we are actually out of time, but Ayo offered to stay for another half hour. So if you must go, we understand, but we will stay if there are any questions.
And perhaps Kelly or somebody could read some of the comments.
Sure. Yeah, there were.
You don't have to read everyone, but
Marguerite said, I knew that wealthier people immigrate, but perhaps because of forgetting some of what I've learned last year in globalization, I did not know that immigrants to the US were also more likely to have been low income in their native countries. There was a lot of appreciation for the data that you shared. Susan said, seeing statistical numbers in print all across the board reinforces so much to me. I know Jen had said something similar about seeing the data. Thomas, who left by now, but the initial point about who migrates and differences in opportunity was an interesting point I hadn't previously considered, and something that ties nicely with what I'm learning in globalization. Darcy, who works in HR, said the data on hiring is compelling. A lot of talk about education. Gordon said he was really shocked at how education has contributed. Kaylee said, I knew that affirmative action mostly helped white people, but seeing the numbers as they pertain to college admissions was eye-opening. If you wanted to share your comment and I'm not reading it, please feel free to unmute. Sarah said, I've worked in a banking institution for over 18 years, and hearing some of the banking and lending facts here were shocking to me. Joseph said, I thought the quote about how discrimination isn't born from hate for the outer groups, but the sympathy that is reserved for the inner groups was very insightful. Matthew said, I'm very interested about how the GI Bill was implemented in a discriminatory way. Ayo, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
I'm guessing he wasn't here for the first seminar because I went into some detail in the first seminar. Were you there?
I think Matthew left. He was here for the first one, but he had to leave early.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if somebody could tell him that's covered in the first.
I'll let him know.
Yeah. Well,
Tiffany had made a point, I can't find it now, when you were speaking about the study about school children's behavior and how teachers tend to focus more on Black boys. Tiffany had said something along the lines of it resonated with her because she has a 4-year-old son who's one, I think, of only 2 Black boys in a predominantly white school. So she'd been thinking a lot about that.
I can add some thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm finally in a place where I can speak. No, I think what's really fascinating. Once again, like, thank you, Ayo, for participating, for just for offering your services and educating us, and really just showing how all these structures are interconnected. I think what's just really compelling that we as educators should continue to confront and realize is just how many facets of life, from education, to like housing and where you end up living, all the way to structures such as like the banking system, how like many of those are racialized, they continue to reinforce one another, so just that's kind of like my comment for the whole thing. It just really showed us how all of those things continue to mutually reinforce, the inequities that we see, and just how complex it is to possible, but complex to really address those and find solutions to disrupt it.
For sure. Alexandra had said something similar in the chat. She said the note/highlight that individual racism plays a smaller part in perpetuating structured versus systemic racism was oddly refreshing and unfortunately edifying. I have often heard that the theory that systems of white supremacy and racism would continue without white people, this helped provide some context.
And also say the question, do you think we should get rid of standardized testing since it doesn't make education more equitable? And somebody answered, I think the answer is yes and no. From my perspective, I think it is used as a mechanism on how teachers can improve teaching the state curriculum standards, but I believe it is how the students is learning material that contributes on how well they do on this standard test. And essentially, I agree. It's not the standardized assessment itself, and it can be very good. And for example, it can be used as to check bias, right? So it's how it's used. It's not the standardized testing itself per se. It can be used for good and bad or in between.
Any other remaining thoughts or questions or comments maybe I missed in the chat that folks want to highlight?
Somebody wrote, I had not thought about the impact of favoritism benefiting the privileged even without discrimination. I also was disheartened by not only lack of progress, but that some settings show losses in equity over the past 2 decades. Yep. I also found the discussion of disaggregated data of immigrants really eye-opening. And by the way, when I have presented that data, when members who were from for example, Southeast Asian populations were like, thank you, you know, they were, you know, they say, you know, when people say Asian, they immediately think, you know, they're assuming that you're just meaning Indian and Chinese and Korean, and they sort of make broad sweeping generalizations that include all Asians. And they said, you know, our situation is extremely different and we get lost and fall through the cracks. So let's not make these sweeping generalizations about any group, right? There's very different situations, and there's strong patterns, right? You might have noticed, look at the countries that are sending the more whiter, higher educated immigrants versus the countries that are sending more darker skinned, low income, less educated immigrants. So we have to have a more nuanced view, and also we have to, it's not like a Black versus immigrant thing. You know, we want to increase opportunity for everybody who is not experiencing opportunity.
Okay, I think we're almost done, right? All the questions and the chats are answered. Thank you so much, Ayo, for staying over time. And this was a great presentation. We will make the recording available at the Commonwealth Honors Program's website for people to go back, and because it was like too much to absorb right now. So I will definitely go back and watch it again, just stop and read again and so forth. So thank you so much. And we hope to see you again here at MCC sometime in the future.
Perfect. And don't forget that there's in that resource list, there's tons of resources where you can follow up if you have a particular interest.